the concept of systemic racism is something that it seems like everyone wants to argue about it today, but I can't help but feel like a lot of people who use the term haven't stopped to think about what it actually means. Well, that's what I want to try to unpack in this video. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, the notion systemic racism is something that you hear a lot. It's a talking point in a lot of our debates currently about politics, injustice, and especially obviously as it relates to race in the history of America, things like Jim Crow, sharecropping, on and on into mass incarceration. So it's a concept that a lot of people talk about, kind of gets volleyed back and forth in a lot of our debates. But what I want to do in this video is I want to just kind of slow down and break down the two terms, systemic and racism, and actually try to get into, approach a definition of the concept. Before even judging whether or not it's a valid concept, good or bad, or whatever, I just want to try to articulate as best I can what it actually means, or what people who use the term are trying to describe or get at. So, at the risk of being overly simplistic, I'm just going to take each word at a time. The first word, systemic. The root word is system. Might be obvious. But the way I like to approach this concept, set aside the concept of racism just for a second and think about the term systemic. The way that I try to approach this when I think about it as it applies to any issue societally is what is a system and how does a system function? And the way that I think about that is the concept of an incentive structure. So people occupy systems and structures and institutions. Whether that is as simple as it could be your family, it could be your household unit, it could be a church or an organization you voluntarily are part of, or your place of employment, or maybe your neighborhood has kind of a system in which it functions. Your city obviously would, with things like laws and policies. So we all interact with systems, things that are bigger than us, right, that we participate in. And systems have incentive structures. They're built as incentive structures. Humans make decisions. Humans have agency to make choices and take action and make decisions. But they occupy systems that incentivize or encourage or discourage or disincentivize certain actions and certain decisions. And so the concept of incentive structure to me is really helpful when I start to approach the concept of systemic anything. So I start to ask myself, what is the system in which is being discussed, and how does that system incentivize or disincentivize certain actions, certain decisions, certain ideas, you could argue. And so as we approach the concept of systemic racism, camping out a little bit on the concept of systemic first can be really helpful. So what is the incentive structure at play? You know, that's when you start to think about on a systemic level, that's kind of what you're starting to approach. What's the incentive structure in play? How does it look? How does it function? And how does it encourage people to live, to act, to have their being, so to speak, to use a biblical analogy. Okay, the second concept is racism, obviously, and this is one where it seems so obvious, the definition should seem so obvious, but it actually starts to get really complicated when you start to try to use precise language around it, and I want to try to use precise language here. So, to hazard a definition of racism, I would argue that it is to attribute significance or meaning, especially social significance and social meaning, to the biological category of a race when it comes to categorizing humans. So I'm going to say that again. It's kind of a long, loaded sentence. But to be racist, I would argue, is to attribute significance, social meaning, and status to the concept of race when it comes to categorizing groups of humans. Okay, so the classic historical example of this is obviously the racial doctrines that supported something like chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm sure if you're watching this video, you know this already, but just to repeat it, to put a point on it, the doctrines, when it came to racial doctrines, the doctrines that supported slavery were biological and scientific in nature. They're being widely debunked now. It was very pseudoscience at the time. But nevertheless, at the time, the functional doctrines supported the notion that humans could be subgrouped into races, biological races, and that certain races were more or less intellectually superior or inferior, or had certain physical characteristics that made them fit for certain social roles, right? And then the obvious kind of historical case is that sub-Saharan Africans, by virtue of their biological classification into their racial group, were best fit socially to occupy the status of slave. That is, as succinctly as I can put it, the racial doctrine that supported chattel slavery, right? Which obviously feeds into a lot of American history. But that is, again, I sound like I'm being overly obvious or overly simplistic, but that I think is to drill right down to the bottom. That is the kind of classic definition of racist. So to be racist on an individual level is to say or believe or act as though there is significance to these racial groups. So to believe that a certain group of people has a certain attribute by virtue of their biological racial classification, that is to be racist. I mean, that's, I think, about as simply as I can put it. So those are the two terms, systemic and then racist. How does it function when you combine these concepts? And this does get a little slippery, it does get hard, but I think it's possible to approach a definition by saying that systemic racism, when someone's talking about systemic racism, what they're talking about is they're talking about an incentive structure that encourages or perpetuates or reifies decisions and actions of humans that feed into giving significance to racial classifications, right? So an incentive structure that humans occupy that incentivizes decisions, actions that reify these racial differences, right? I think that is about as concisely, I know it doesn't feel very concise, but it's about as concise as I can put a definition of systemic or institutional racism. So I want to end this video with having that definition kind of teased out a little bit. I want to end this video with a few thoughts on what I think is helpful about this concept and why I think it deserves attention, and also some questions I have about it that are ongoing in our kind of public discourse right now. So, first of all, something that's really helpful is just the systemic level thinking. I think is extremely helpful in general when it's applied to racism, but when it's applied to other social ills, it's really helpful particularly in our culture, which has been well documented that Western culture is pretty radically individualistic. There's this libertarian individualistic kind of agency that we believe humans have that tends to elide or gloss over or ignore the systemic level impact, the ways that systems shape human desires, the way that systems shape human thought, and the way that systems incentivize human action and actually form us in some ways. So the systemic level kind of angle of the concept of systemic racism, I think, is really helpful because it kind of raises our eyes a little bit. In its best form, it raises us to look at the systems in which we live. What I said a few minutes ago, it raises our attention and brings our attention to the structures that we occupy. And how might those structures be shaping us and pointing us in certain directions? So that's extremely helpful. And kind of dovetailing with that, the other helpful thing about it is we're super focused because of the human agency, individual choice focus we have in our culture. We tend to be very focused on encouraging individual choice. And but also the shadow side of that is that blaming individual choice if things go wrong. Those two things kind of are two sides of the same coin. And so systemic thinking really helps us nuance that a little bit, which is to say that I do believe, at bottom, I really do believe that no matter what system you're a part of, I do believe in human agency. So I really do believe that no matter what broken or messed up or privileged system you're a part of, there's always choices to be exercised. Human choice, well, you can't get nuanced enough in a short YouTube video, but I would argue, I think, at bottom, human choice can never be fully removed from an individual. But on the other side, they always occupy a system. And so the point that can be really helpful here is if there is a systemic impact that is having a negative or deleterious effect on the people within that system, then one way to get at that is to then change the system. So if the incentive structure is broken or not healthy, you can always encourage the people in the system to make better choices, but sometimes you can just change the system. Like you can just change the incentive structure at the systemic level, and that can also have a very positive effect. One example of this, to take it out of the realm of race for momentarily, one example of this right now that's live is the conversation around social media. Social media has certain incentive structures to it. Namely, it incentivizes doom scrolling. It incentivizes just mindless blank staring at your screen, keeping your eyes on the screen so that big tech companies can make ad revenue. That's an incentive structure. And the whole conversation around regulating big tech, regulating social media or not, from the social policy point of view, I think is ultimately a conversation about how do we want to change the system in which many of us partake and participate. I mean, I'm putting this video on YouTube for crying out loud, so I'm part of social media. Nevertheless, that's just one example of systems level thinking, and sometimes we need to think about changing the system, right? Sometimes we just have to do that. And this can be really systemic racism when we talk about racial disparities and injustices. It does have one layer to contribute to the conversation. That's very helpful. Some questions I have about it. First of all, one question I have is that it can be really tricky because to be racist does inevitably, on some level, I think, get back to the individual human will and the individual human prejudices. And so the one open-ended question I have is, can a system as such be racist the way a human can be racist, right? Can a system demonstrate that same kind of ill will, prejudice that an individual human can? I know there are proponents of these ideas that would absolutely say, yes, that's true. I'm still somewhere in the middle on that. I think that's a little bit of that's where the concept of, one way in which the concept of systemic racism can get a little squishy and get a little hard to precisely nail down. So that's one question I have about it. But then the other question or other kind of concerns that I have about the concept have less to do with the concept itself, which I think at its value, the way I've defined it here, I hope I'm making it clear that I think that it is worth serious thought. So my other questions have less to do with the concept itself than the way in which the concept is being deployed and used, especially rhetorically in our conversations and dialogues today. I have real questions and concerns with the ways it's being used, almost as like a rhetorical kind of sledgehammer to just knock aside other points, other arguments, or other modes of analysis. So sometimes what I see happening is that people will take a very true social observation, which is something like the wealth gap between black and white Americans, which is just an undeniable and kind of just a horrific thing if you look at it, if you just look at the actual metrics of the wealth gap that are measured along these demographic racial lines. A lot of people might take that reality and then use a concept like systemic racism as the only explanatory variable or analytical tool to analyze and explain that reality that we find ourselves in. That's a little bit concerning to me, because to me, any social reality like that has to be multifaceted. You need to have there must be multiple variables at play, and to flatten it all out into saying it's just the level of system, the system is de facto producing this, is concerning to me, because it actually gets back to what I was saying earlier, which is that I don't think that humans are ever wholly devoid of agency. And I get that there's a really tense back and forth kind of interplay here between the impact of the system and the impact of the human agent. And it is also very, very true, I hope I made it very clear, that sometimes human agents are in systems that shape them to a degree that they don't realize. And this is one of the arguments that feeds into certain kind of arguments that come out of critical race theory, frankly, which is that white people have been shaped by the institutions that they have lived in the Western world to such a degree that they have internalized kind of racist attitudes and racist ways of being without even realizing it. That's a whole other conversation. All I'm trying to say is that I do believe that systems shape people. Nevertheless, I still hold to a really firm belief that humans always have agency no matter the system they're in, and to flatten out a social analysis by using a concept like systemic racism or institutional racism as the only possible explanation. And therefore, and this is where I have questions and concerns about the work of someone like an Ibram Kendi, who on the one hand is helpfully pointing us to the systems level thinking, but on the other hand, if that's the only possible cause of the disparities that we see in society, then the only possible solution is to reform the system. And I think that's a little concerning to me, because if it's not the only cause, there's other variables that we're not allowed to talk about, because of what's considered polite or what's considered, off limits in our discourse today. If we can't talk about other variables that might be at play, then we're cutting ourselves off from other possible solutions that could really help us build a more just society, which is ultimately what we all want. And so my concerns are less to do with the concept as such, the concept itself of systemic racism, because I think it has value to add to the conversation. And my concerns are a little bit more with the ways that it gets latched onto and deployed simplistically and shallowly in the conversations that we have to be able to have in a better way today. So at the end of the day, I think it is certainly, at minimum, it's certainly an interesting concept, systemic racism. It's one that's worth really careful thought, and I think the systemic level angle on it especially is really crucial for those of us who live in the really ruggedly individualistic culture that we occupy in the West. It's really, really important tool to bring to bear on the conversation and the way that we understand how our society functions. And like I said, ultimately the ways that we can work towards building a more just, more equitable society, particularly along racial lines. So there you go. There's some of my thoughts in an attempt to define a really notoriously slippery and fraught and controversial topic of conversation today. But I hope you found this helpful. I hope that you found something in here to provoke some thought, provoke further reflection or questions. If you have pushback, if you have other ideas, if you have things you would add to my definition, please post below. I'd love to hear them. And as always, thank you for watching.